Welcome everyone to Male Fuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about the X-Files Season 2 Episode 13. It's called Irresistible. And how are we halfway through Season 2 already? Time is flying in, but this is an episode with a serial killer, or at least he becomes a serial killer. He starts off kind of, building his way up to it, but he's a fetishist who really likes cutting off the hair and fingernails of young women. He works at a funeral parlor, and he's kind of caught doing that early on, but then it escalates beyond that to the point where he's actually killing people, so he's getting fresh bodies, as it were. The episode has a very strong link to Scully, and not because the crime itself has any link to her to begin with, but more just because after everything she went through earlier this season with being kidnapped, of losing that time, she's felt a little bit off, perhaps, right? I complimented the episode after she came back for addressing that she shouldn't just feel 100% already. It was nice that it had some ramifications. I also really like that this episode takes that a step further and does this idea that, no, she's still pretty messed up. All those things that happened to her have consequences. The passing of her father last year is even brought up at one point in this episode. And this very much ties into this idea that she is struggling with certain types of cases, that she is seeing these victims, their dead bodies, the mutilation, the way that something horrific is happening to these people is affecting her. She's having a hard time dealing with it, and she's also having a hard time admitting that she's not dealing with it well to Mulder. She doesn't want to lower her guard. And as she points out in the therapist scene in this episode, not because she doesn't trust Mulder or doesn't feel close to Mulder, but because she doesn't want to feel like he needs to protect her. She doesn't want to be the vulnerable one that needs protection from the partner, right? She wants to be independent, so she feels like an asset in the partnership rather than one that needs to be looked after. So I really appreciated them exploring this a little bit, and I think it added some depth to what Scully already went through this season. I think one of the biggest problems that can sometimes happen with TV shows, especially TV shows that are from this era, where things could be a little bit more just, episodic and a little less serialized, is that big things would happen and then you move on and the characters barely ever mention that it happened. But what she did go through was kind of a big deal, and I like that they're still exploring the idea that she's still affected by it, even a good handful of episodes later. This felt really nice, and the ending with her finally breaking down and just sort of crying into Mulder's arms, I thought was a good ending, especially since that he once again asked if she was okay, and she lies again. She says she's fine, but she's breaking up as she's saying it. It's this idea that even at the end of the episode, she's trying to not almost put that burden onto Mulder, even though that's like I think from an outside perspective, we all look at her and go, that's ridiculous. No, use him as a friend, as someone who can strengthen you, as an ally. But she doesn't want to put that burden on him, but she just can't. She can't contain it anymore and breaks down into his arms. And I really like that. The only critique I'd have of the ending is actually just after that. Mulder does the wrap-up narration for this episode, where he's talking about the case. I felt it was a bit odd. It was like they were crunched for time, because he's literally still saying his final line as the credit comes up, and normally that doesn't happen. Normally they have the final line, there'll be a moment of like, oh, and then the credit will start in a sort of more ambient, kind of eerie way. Whereas here he was still talking, which said to me that they were just a little bit over time within the edit, and they didn't want to cut anything else. So this was just a way to save like 2 seconds of precious screen time. That said, the episode also does something else that I really like, and it feeds into what Scully's going through. And that is that in this episode, the bad guy is just a guy. Now, there are some visuals, there are some things throughout the episode to suggest that he's a demon or something, or an alien or whatever. But even if it turned out to be the case that he was something monstrous by the end, in a more physical sense, I still really appreciated at the start of this episode, it's in Twin Cities, and the Twin Cities cop is like, oh, this must be aliens who have dug up this grave and done this to this woman. It matches all the literature about aliens. And Mulder's skeptical. Mulder, for once, is actually like not on board. And even if it turned out that it was some kind of supernatural entity, I would have still really appreciated the fact that Mulder didn't think that for most of the episode. In fact, if anything, I might have even liked it a little bit more. Because here he's still right, which is a little frustrating. I really want Mulder to be wrong a little bit more often. But I do appreciate that this is not an alien, it's not a monster in a a literal physical sense. It's a human being, and that's kind of like what the scary part of this is supposed to be, is that there are just people out there that are monsters, that are predators, that kill people. There's a lot of talk in this episode. The local cop says that, people here still leave their doors unlocked. They don't believe bad things like this can happen. He references, I don't know what specific killer he's referencing, but I'm sure it's probably one from the time period that people may have got the reference to. But he mentions someone killing young boys. I have an idea in my head of who that might be, just based on my vague knowledge of famous serial killers. But he says, people had a hard time, believing that could even happen. So it was almost ignored because no one believed it was going on. And that's why the guy was able to do it for so long. Here in this episode, Scully is kind of wrestling with this idea that there's these people out there that are like this. And the therapy session's obviously one of the big scenes of the episode, because she's kind of opening up about a lot of this finally. And talking about how she's kind of lost her faith in herself to protect other people, and she really needs to get that back. Like she always knew there were monsters out there, but she found strength in the idea that she was part of the side that was there to protect everyone else. But she's kind of she's almost effectively she became a victim, and she's not quite been able to shake that feeling, I guess, since that happened. And it makes sense that she would feel those things. So this idea at the end, and Mulder kind of says this in his wrap-up narration, is that we forget sometimes that it's not always aliens and like monsters, that there's actual just real people that are monsters out there. And I think the idea that Scully was seeing this demonic version of this guy in her dreams, because a great little dream sequence where she looks down at the operating table, or the mortician's table, whatever you want to call it. It's herself on the table, implying that she's worried that she could be a victim. And this is before she gets into danger in the episode. And then standing looking over is the demonic, quote-unquote, form of this guy. And I think the demonic form was just a representation. And this idea that it's almost like saying to the audience, it's easier for you, the audience, to just believe this is a demon or a monster of some kind. That's actually more comforting than it being just a person who could be out there right now. The only maybe little nitpick I would have of this like kind of recurring motif of sometimes seeing him as a monster, I don't know if I'd have had the guy at the start of the episode see it, right? Because it makes sense that other victims see it. The killer, what was his name? Faster. No, it's Faster. Donald Faster, or Donnie Faster, they kept calling him. He like picks up a prostitute like halfway through the episode, and this is his first actual like murder victim. And it's well directed. David Nutter directed this, which made me pretty confident going in. Although somewhere between last week and this week, I kind of like my mind got mixed up. Maybe I'm confusing it with a different show I'm watching. But I went into this at the start thinking that I was getting into a stinker based on like the IMDb rating, which for this episode's high. It's an 8.0. It's very high for a TV episode. But for some reason, I remembered it wrong and thought I was getting into like a 6.0. And thought, oh, it's probably going to be a rough episode. And halfway through, I was thinking, this is pretty good. It's got a lot of atmosphere, and I'm kind of digging the vibes. And the guy playing the killer is maybe a little like hammy at times, but I'm loving the dramatic lighting on him, and I'm kind of digging the vibe of it. It's almost adding to the effect. But anyway, it makes sense that like this prostitute sees him in this demonic form for a split second right before she dies, and then Scully sees him that way in her dream, and then again. When she's actually a victim towards the end. And those make sense to me. It's this idea that it's just a representation of them seeing his true self. And I get that the idea that the funeral director at the start of the episode, who catches him cutting hair off of a corpse. And the episode does it takes the time to show you part of this woman's funeral to sort of try and make you sympathize with her and see her as a person and not just a corpse. That was a very intentional choice there, which makes sense to me. But he catches him cutting the hair, and he's like, oh, you're a monster. But he has this little moment where he sees him, a glimpse where he turns into the demonic form, And obviously this is like the first couple of minutes of the episode, so I'm expecting, oh, this is just what he is. But in hindsight, I'm thinking that maybe he saw that a little too early, because this is before he's even realized that there's like what he's done. Like, he's not seen that he's taken some hair off of a corpse yet and messed up the body. And then he calls him a monster at that point. He has this glimpse of him as a demon before that, when he just sort of sees him in the dark for a brief second. And I kind of get this idea that it's like, oh, in a moment where he's caught off guard, he kind of sees him for what he truly is, and it's like a hint, that there is something dangerous about this guy that kind of fuels things. But it would have probably made more sense to me if the glimpse of him as a monster, if you're going to have this guy have that moment where he sees him as this, for it to happen after he sees what he's done to the body, potentially. But I guess you could argue it's more about seeing like the look in his eyes, and because the victim doesn't obviously see him after he's killed her. The victim sees before, when she sort of like gets scared and sees the intent in his eyes. If anything, the attempted victim, which is a weird sentence to say, obviously the victim's not attempting to be a victim, but when he tries to go after another woman at night school, and we have this scene where he's sort of he's come up with a reason to ask her a question at her car, but he puts his hand up on the door to sort of trap her between the door and himself, and she gets scared and makes a run for it. I don't think she gets a glimpse of this demonic form. And it would have made a lot of sense for her to see this and kind of like visually give you a representation of why she goes straight into fight or flight mode, where she's like screaming for help and she's getting away from him the best she can. And she does get away from it. It actually ends up with him in the local police station, which is where he sees Scully interviewing someone else, which was a nice little switcheroo, because we just saw him in this scene, and this woman yelling for help, and it cuts to the local cops saying, hey, we've picked up who we think it is, and your mind naturally goes, oh, they arrested him, and because of what he tried to do, they've connected the dots, only to reveal that the guy they're going to question is just some random dude who was going to a prostitute and get into a fight. And it's not actually him at all. But our man is in the other cell and sees Scully. And it's the sort of thing where if you'd told me before this episode that Scully was going to be in danger from a serial killer, left out the other stuff of how it ties back into her trauma from previous episodes. If you just said, oh no, here's an episode where we're following a serial killer who's this sick fetishist who really likes cutting off hair and nails, and Scully's going to be someone that he goes after, right? The killer's going to see Scully, get obsessed with her and target her, and she's going to be in danger and like possibly need to be rescued by the end of the episode. I would have probably rolled my eyes at that and been very critical, because without the rest of the context, it does just sound like, oh, Scully's in danger again, and it feels like we can't do this to her that often. But the reason why it works here and why it doesn't feel like just another cheap, oh, we're going to put the female part of the team in danger, is because it ties into these themes of her struggling to get over being a victim before. So it's the idea that this is being used to kind of like push her into a state where she is willing to break down with Mulder at the end, where she is maybe like, if anything, what I was expecting when she does get targeted by him, because she leaves the city at one point, and it's like under the guise of like, oh, I can do better work back in Washington, but really she is feeling like she can't handle it. She won't admit that, but that's why she goes back. But then once they find her fingerprint and she's feeling a bit more confident, she's like, no, I'll come back out. I'll help you catch this guy. And then the killer goes after her after she comes out the airport and gets a rental car and rides her off the road. That's a weird sentence. Drives her off the road. Forces her off the road. That's a better sentence. When this like all happens, I was thinking to myself, oh, is this how she gets her mojo back? She's going to win. She's going to like get out of this herself. She's going to fight him down, and she's going to succeed. It's a little bit more in the middle of that, actually, because she does obviously do a good job of fighting back. She runs about the house. We get a nice stalking sequence of him looking for her, nice dark shadows, all that stuff. And she's able to spray him in the eyes with some stuff. But ultimately, it's kind of like he is kind of maybe going to win, and he's on top of her. Like, it might go bad here. And then that's when Mulder and the FBI bust in because they've tracked down the house belonging to his mother or sister or whatever. And that's all fine. And, I think going into like this final part of the episode, I was expecting her to have a decisive victory. And this would be like how she sort of like gets, like I say, her mojo back. But that said, the follow-up scene to this being her breaking down and finally kind of like showing Mulder her vulnerability obviously meant that that couldn't be what this scene was. It's a sort of thing where I went in expecting one thing, but once I saw the reason why they did it this way, to have her kind of open up to Mulder, it made sense, and I understood, and I didn't feel like it was like whiffing on the potential. It felt like, okay, no, this was the purpose. It was to get her to this point. It probably will strengthen her in the long run to have this experience once again. Certainly, like, you know, it's all about that, getting to that point where she is willing to show Mulder how she's feeling about this. So, you know, she's had a rough year, has Scully. She's been through the thick and, you know, thin of it. Yeah, just some more stuff on the killer himself. I did enjoy the performance. It was a bit hammy at times, but I really like, because there's a lot of scenes of him talking to various people, and he's got kind of a sort of methodical, gravelly voice, and he kind of even set up a couple of avenues that it doesn't go down, and I don't even feel shortchanged by it in the long run. But he gets a job as like a delivery guy for like a food company or something, and he's like, basically this woman's like trusting him so much by saying, hey, if we're not in, the back door will be open, which I thought was going to lead to him like sneaking back in here and killing one of her daughters, because he's eyeing up the daughter when she shows up. But the most that comes of it is that he sniffs some of the hair in the bathroom that he finds in the bin. But yeah, like, I think the scenes where he's interacting with potential victims like that, or when he's interviewing for the job and the woman who's giving him the interview, she's standoffish at first, but then he like starts like noticing her makeup, and like says, you know, what type it is, and he gets it right. Probably something he knows from working at a funeral home and dealing with the bodies, I guess. Or maybe that's just part of his obsession. He really cares about the cosmetics. I mean, after all, he does take nails and hair, and he does seem to really care about what goes into maintaining them. He always asks, both the prostitute and then Scully later on, he asks, like, what type of hair do you have? Do you have dry hair, normal hair? Do you need special treatment? Like, he's got, you know, he's got like a range of shampoos, because he wants to shampoo the hair before he kills them or whatever. I thought those were suitably creepy moments. I thought like he came across as dangerous, and to further drive home that theme of like anyone normal among us could be someone who is dangerous and has these desires. There's a whole back and forth with Mulder and the local cop about how, oh, he's been described as a normal looking dude. That actually makes him very tough to find. Like, he's a normal looking dude who's like in his late 20s. Although he does look older than late 20s to me, and I don't know if this is just that people looked older than they do now back in the day. I don't know if it's just me being older, but like, I would say this dude looks older than me, honestly, and I'm meant to be 7 years older than him according to this episode. But I mean, you know, chalk that up to whatever factors you want. I don't know, but this idea that he is going to be hard to find because he's not someone with a record, and he's not someone who stands out as looking weird, it's catching people off guard or anything like that. He is a normal looking. I mean, I think he does act quite intense the way he stares at people, don't get me wrong, but of course we are seeing this through what they're choosing to show to make it, you know, to ramp up the thriller elements of the scenes in the story. So that makes sense. Interestingly as well, when Mulder's frustrated when they realize Scully's missing and they find the car, and if anything, if I have a critique of structure of this episode, it's just that their realization that Scully's missing and that it's probably him that's got her does feel a little bit quick, and like they had to get through it very quickly just to get to the next part of the important stuff in the plot. So they just very quickly accept that she must be in danger when it feels like it's only been a couple hours since her plane landed. I'm not sure we're at like manhunt levels of, oh shit, something really must be wrong kind of thing. But I mean, maybe, again, I think that maybe is just a bit nitpicky, but it does feel like it moves really quickly through those realizations. But of course, we have to get to all the stalking stuff in the house. We have to get to the climax and all that. So it makes sense. But he does get frustrated and he says, oh, people see, you know, this, like, in every city, people notice, they get video recordings of Elvis everywhere. This is even more true now. This is before smartphones were filming everything. This is back when having a camera was a bit more rare or notable. But he says, no one noticed a pretty girl being driven off the road by, like, a maniac in a car. And this is not the point of the scene, but it did stick out to me that he described her as a pretty woman. It did stick out to me. Not that I think it's that important, it has to mean that much. Obviously, Scully's an attractive woman. It makes sense that people know, men particularly, notice attractive women. That's not like a weird thing to point out. But given that I'm expecting that we're going to be at some point down the line doing some sort of a romance with these two, it felt like maybe like an early little seed, just to let you know that he thinks of her as pretty. I mean, of course he does, but like just to put it in a dialogue like that feels like a little tip of the hat, as it were. I think I like how focused the episode feels, and the idea of we're exploring these characters who are dealing with the fact that it's tough to just accept that someone this monstrous is among us. The local cop, the captain or whoever he is at the police station, he is constantly just like in shock that this is happening, and it was easier for him to jump to aliens and other explanations when Mulder showed up. And it's almost ironic that Mulder shows up and says, nah, this is just a guy, this is just someone who's got a sickness, and this is someone who's getting obsessed. Because this guy, this local cop, he is turning to aliens and paranormal almost as a comfort mechanism, because it's easier to accept that as like a spooky unknown thing than to accept that this is something they have to deal with as a regular part of his job. Whereas Mulder doesn't turn to aliens and paranormal because he's dealing it to cope with the real horrors of the world. Like, Mulder, as we've known from since the start of the show, was very good at being a special crimes FBI agent. He had a good rate of catching criminals, and they talked about that all the way back at the start of the show, and that's why he's maybe so good at dealing with this case once he steps in. But Mulder doesn't look at aliens and all this other stuff because he's trying to comfort himself. He's not comforted by it at all. He's looking for this stuff because he has a direct connection and believes it's there, and thinks that other shadier things are happening because of it. It's almost like, if anything, you could argue there's a little bit of a disconnect with an episode like this, where this episode wants to be a bit more serious and kind of saying, no, this is the sort of real thing that's out there, and we're tackling it with a little bit more gravitas, perhaps, than we do other stuff. But inherently, it's almost like in a meta sense, you're kind of saying, you kind of have to acknowledge that, yeah, all the fun stuff we're doing with all the aliens, yeah, that's obviously just a bit of fun and fiction, right? We're doing good stuff with it, but that's what it is. This episode's kind of a bit more real things that are going on, and other than a bit of imagery, and to suggest that we kind of somehow, we seek comfort in there being an explanation that's not our fault, right? This isn't quite the exact same thing, but it's kind of like whenever, like, I remember, like, after Columbine happened, and there was a lot of like, oh, they listened to Marilyn Manson, it's the music did it, right? Because the idea that it just is easier for people to have something to blame, right? And this isn't quite the same as like turning to aliens and paranormal as an explanation. It's not the same at all, but this idea to blame violent video games or blame music or blame movies and say they're the reason why things are wrong, because that's something that can conceivably be fixed. There's something, if you just ban this thing, it'll stop all the problems and this will never happen again. And that's not true. We know that's not true, but that's the delusion that some people try to operate under, because it's this comforting idea that if you just take this thing that we can easily stop if we want to stop it, and it'll stop all these other nasty things from happening. But that's not true, because the horror that some people are just like this, obviously there are things to do. There's a whole discussion about mental health and recognizing problems and treating people and dealing with it in other ways. Obviously there are some answers, but the idea that it's not something that's easily fixed. It's not like a simple on-off switch, right? Like banning a movie or a game or a bit of music is. It's something a bit more complex, a bit more nuanced, something that has to be done through a systemic level, something that has to be done over time, something that has to be done in so many ways, and some things could still fall through the cracks, even if the system was much, much better than it actually is. These are these things, trying to sort of struggle with that is much scarier than accepting that it's just, it's the fault of one thing, right? And I feel like I'm getting a little bit of these vibes here, even though, again, it's a little bit different, turning to something that's alien or whatever. But it's the idea of just not accepting that a human being is just capable of doing something that horrific. But some are, and that's kind of the truth of this episode. And you know, the truth is out there, as I say, but sometimes the truth is coming from inside the house. That's my description of this episode. The truth is coming from inside the house. On that front, I really like the vibe of the episode. I like what it does for Scully's character, her struggling with this throughout, and struggling to deal with the idea of, like, you know, the PTSD effectively of what she went through, and how she struggles to tell Mulder that she's going through that. And it makes and the episode does a good job of making that clear to the audience, you know, because the therapist flat out says, is it because you don't trust him? Is it because you don't feel comfortable with Mulder? And it makes it clear that Scully says outright, no, it's not that at all. Just in case you misinterpret this is not about trust. It's not about being close to Mulder. It's not about anything with that relationship. Nothing's wrong with that. It's purely this idea is she doesn't want to feel like she's the burden that needs to be protected. But not just because she doesn't want that on Mulder, that's part of it, but because that represents that she wants to feel independent. She wants to feel like she can deal with things on her own and she doesn't have to rely on others. And she's really struggling with that. So I really like what it does with Scully's character. I like how creepy the bad guy is. All that stuff is good. Yeah, I like it went in super quick. I thought it was a very entertaining episode. I tend to enjoy when things get a bit darker, so I mean, I'm more inclined to like the creepiness of this episode. But yeah, all that stuff was good. So and all I really have is minor nitpicks, like the final narration felt rushed because they were out of time and they had to like wrap it up. Mulder, come on, the credits are rolling. Or maybe like how quickly the progression of like Scully being kidnapped, they realizing she's missing, and then, oh, we found the car, and we basically, because it's white paint scratched on the car, we're convinced 100% it's him. It feels like a bit of a leap for them to just assume that the killers went after her. You know, it feels like there should have been maybe a couple of steps in there to get to that conclusion, but it's a minor quibble because we have to get to the more interesting stuff, and that's fine. So there you go, that's my thoughts on Irresistible. Let's have a look and see what's coming next time from the X-Files. We've got an episode called Die Hard. Not Die Hard, sorry, that's a Freudian. I just like Die Hard, apparently. So I saw Die Hand and said Die Hard. No, it's Die Hand. Actually, hold on. I don't think it's actually Die. I think it's D, because I think the second half of this looks like it might be German. Die Hand, Die Verletz. So I'm going to assume that that's German, and because D is one of the words for the, I think, because German has three, like D, das, and der, because their words are gendered, and depending on which word you're talking about, you have to use a different the. Same with which is ein, eine, and eins, I think. Like, I did a little bit of German in high school, hated it, but I remember that annoying fact. Anyway, no disrespect to any Germans, I just like learning languages. It's a me thing. Here is a description on IMDb. The agents investigate a murder in a small town populated by devil worshippers. Okay, I'm in. Mainly because, and it's not that that concept specifically appeals to me, it just appeals to me here because we've not really dealt with devil worshippers on X-Files yet. It feels like an untapped stream. So I'm curious. I'm curious to see what we can do with this. So yeah, let's do it. I'm into it. So there you go. That's this episode of X-Files. I will see you guys next time. It's goodbye. I don't want to say goodbye already. Thanks for watching. All the usual stuff. You can support on Patreon, patreon.com/MailFuzzTV, and help keep all the content coming. I wouldn't be able to keep doing this and making all the reviews I do without the patrons. So if you see the names at the end or whatever, you think, hey, I would be part of that, you can go over and do that on Patreon. But every patron, every donation, every like, all of it matters. Thank you very much for joining. I do appreciate it. Keep watching X-Files, and I will see you next time. That's not what I say at the end of this. Have you got any vanilla?